So yesterday I went to go see It Lives Inside at the movie theater. This is the new horror film directed by Bishal Dutta, and bringing a different sort of monster to life here, going more towards the Indian, Eastern Asian type of pulling ideas and inspiration from that type of philosophy, religion, mythology, whatever you want to call it, and creating sort of a new type of supernatural horror. Now, on the surface, this movie does kind of follow the, I guess you can say, the familiar cookie cutter sort of framing of most of these kinds of horror movies. It's about two teens, and they basically get involved with this. How can I put it? This, I don't know if it's a demon or a creature. It's a very different kind of antagonist compared to other horror movies. It's not like a lost spirit or a traditional demon like what you would see in The Nun or something like a possession like The Exorcist. No, this thing eats souls, and the way it does it is little by little with time. There's probably a metaphor here that I'm missing, but overall, it's pretty easy to understand, even if you're not familiar with that sort of Eastern Indian type of stuff. Because again, it follows that very similar framework. You've got two teens who they care about each other. One of them gets, I don't want to spoil it entirely, but one of them gets caught up in this entity, and it's up to the other one to try to save her and save everybody else from eventually being, I guess, tortured, tormented, whatever. I don't want to. I have to be careful what I say. I don't want to spoil it for you. But so the thing about the movie, I think that works is that this is a very different kind of creature. They do hold off on showing you the creature until later on in the film. You just see shadows and things like that. So I do commend Bishal Dutta for taking his time with the movie. The movie does have a bit of a slow start. He takes his time establishing the lore, establishing what this creature is. And when you start seeing the scares to me weren't that scary. It's one of those situations where it wasn't like The Nun where there were a couple of good jump scares. Here it's more so what gets you is the fear of the creature. You kind of have to pretend like you're the main characters for it to really have an effect on you. I haven't really been quote unquote scared at a horror movie in a very long time, but there is that sort of creepy, chilling atmosphere that a good horror movie can give you. This one doesn't really have that. It's sort of lacking the atmosphere and the real sort of maybe the audio engineering or just the overall, setup of other similar movies. But what I found interesting about this movie was the lore behind it, because obviously these types of spiritual entities have had different names all throughout history and different cultures. In this movie, I like how he's taking the Indian culture and sort of trying to explain it, trying to borrow something from that instead of going to the traditional Christian or even jinns for Islam. Here we're having something that's a little bit different. Now, what I found interesting about this movie that put a smile on my face, specifically as somebody who is known to cover Dragon Ball over in my other channel, Geekdom 101, is that in order to defeat this creature, you have to trap it inside of a jar. That sounds familiar, does it not? You know what I'm saying? So now I'm starting to wonder if Toriyama actually borrowed the idea from this mythology. But the performances in the movie, I would say, are pretty decent. I think that the mother is she not that great. She's not that great. Some of her lines seem very hammy. Could have used a few more takes. The movie, it was okay. Like, it's one of those movies where it's a one and done for me. It was okay. I don't regret seeing it. It's not super long. It's about an hour and 40 minutes, give or take, something like that. So they don't really waste that much time. It's just that these concepts and these ideas, I think, could have worked better if you had a more seasoned filmmaker who knew how to set up atmosphere. That's sort of my thing. But I do love how, as you're watching the movie, he does try. And I'm not even saying he's a bad filmmaker. Don't take that the wrong way. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that it's good for what it was, but it wasn't one of those like horror movies that grab you by the throat and pull you in, and you're like, roof, like you're in. Now, it could also be that I had other things on my mind when I was watching the movie. That could be it too. I got a lot of stuff going on. I'm not gonna lie to you about that. That may have taken me out of it just a little bit, but the characters, they show that sort of that innocence, and then in this movie, unlike other horror movies, like some of the ones I've covered earlier this year, the quote unquote teenagers don't get into the trouble. They're not looking for trouble, like Talk to Me. And Talk to Me, they're sitting there messing around with dead hands trying to talk to spirits. Here, that's not what happens. Here, these kids are smart enough to avoid anything spiritual, but it comes for them. And then when it comes for you, you got to do something about it, right? I do think that despite the movie being less than perfect, like I said, I enjoyed it. It's just not one I'm going to go back and revisit anytime soon. I do think that Dutta is one of those filmmakers that needs to be watched in a good way, because I think he's on the cusp of something pretty great. And this movie was close to home for him because, from what I understand, looking into his history, he used to live in India. He actually moved to North America when he was like 4. So he probably heard all these stories. And it just goes back to how you've got different cultures. Like, for example, in Mexico, La Llorona is very well known, even before we saw a movie. So as a fan of horror and as a fan of like superstition and creepy stuff like that, I'm really happy that we're getting horror movies made with monsters and demons from other cultures. Like, I really like that because it helps freshen things up. Seeing the traditional Christian, anti-God demon, if done right, can always be great, but meaning like the anti-biblical God. But seeing different types of enemies, like even last year, when you had like monsters that were built on psychology and things of that nature, like in Smile, like I like that. I like when you've got sort of something creative and borrowing from other cultures. I do think, and I'm not an expert at this, but I do think that people who watch this movie, who are familiar with Indian culture, who are familiar with their mythology, their religion, that I think this will appeal to them and they'll understand it a lot more. Now, I knew about La Llorona since I was a kid, and that movie still wasn't that great. So that does not necessarily guarantee that it's going to resonate with you to where you like it more than somebody who's not of that culture. But I think that at the very least, people who understand it will probably get more out of it. And like I said, the monster in this movie is pretty damn terrifying. The effects they use to bring it to life near the end, like it's one of those things you don't want to end up in a dark alley with this thing. You understand? It's a big, slimy thing that has power. It's got different kinds of abilities and powers. It's different. It has a different way of play when it comes to haunting people. And I can only imagine little kids being told about this thing in India and having nightmares, because this is definitely a movie. I'm telling you this right now, man. If you got little kids, like maybe under the age of like 8 or 9, maybe even a little older, maybe it's not a good idea to take them to this movie, man, because there is, like, the creature is pretty scary. I'm not going to lie to you. For a kid, I mean. For an adult, it's whatever. It's still good looking. The effects I thought were great. But for a child, oof, this could mess them up, yo. But again, I enjoyed the movie. Should you spend your money on it? If you have one of those AMC Stubs cards and you're hell bent on seeing every horror movie this year, go for it. But otherwise, it might be worth just waiting until you get it on streaming. Anyways, those are my thoughts. I'll talk to y'all real soon.